John Kehoe's California Bees and Plants series presents Pondering Pollen. For bees, pollen is the protein source for larval development. She needs to feed her babies. She also needs to produce eggs, so she needs the protein in order to produce those eggs in order to have babies. From the plant perspective, pollen is the male reproductive cells. There's 2 arrows that just shows 2 of the 8 stamens. It's best if it's moved to another plant for cross-pollination, where the pollen will be stuck to the stigma of the female part, highlighted there. Here we see a large female carpenter bee. Her weight caused the redbud flower to pop open and reveal the anthers. She can collect that pollen now and much the same take it back to feed her babies or consume it. Once those anthers are sticking out, I think they stay out, which means other critters can take that pollen. Ceanothus species are great for female bumblebees. You can see how that pollen is just presented nicely for her, and she can get sips of nectar from those tiny flowers on each stop. Here's a close-up of Ceanothus maritimus, and you can appreciate from this angle, as she walks around, she can just brush by all that pollen and it'll just stick to her hairs. Here we see a honeybee feeding on Globegelia. At this point, we don't see her tongue extended, so she's on the way to get some nectar, or perhaps she's just going around and collecting the pollen. I don't know what kind of flower this is. They look like dandelions. It was out in a field, but you can see that this sweat bee has collected a whole bunch of that, which means when she went back to her nest, she had plenty of pollen to feed her babies or ingest herself. There are a lot of varieties of the creeping sages. One of the common parents is Salvia sonomensis. And in this picture, you can see that these 2 anthers are positioned wonderfully so that a pollinator would essentially get a hug and pick up some of that pollen to transfer it to another flower, or for the bee or pollinator to take it back to the nest. The stigma is the dark purple stripe in the center. The California fuchsia arranges its stamens differently. They form almost a brush-like structure, and this tiny little sweat bee could walk in and out of the flower and drink nectar without getting any pollen, or walk out to the pollen, harvest as much as they like, and move on. Elegant Clarkias have 8 stamens, 4 short ones and 4 long ones. Notice the stringy pollen at the bottom of that oval. So here, Clarkias produce sticky pollen in threads, and we can appreciate that, seeing the threads have made almost a mess of her hind leg there, and it's also clinging to the tip of her abdomen. She landed on this flower in position to get some nectar. Maybe she knew she was going to collect pollen too, but regardless, it's a clever adaptation for the Clarkia to boost its reproductive success. This is a male carpenter bee. We know that because of his blue eyes and those tan hairs. But even male bees can cross-pollinate, especially these Clarkias, because it sticks to just about anything, especially those sparse hairs on the back of his abdomen. Here we see a female mason bee. She can do what scientists call a Scrabble dance across the top of these flowers and pack the pollen into those scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen. The males don't have those hairs. She can also ingest some of the pollen that's on her forward legs or those facial hairs. Soaproot plants are interesting. They blossom in the evening, and we can see initially red-looking anthers, but within moments those red jackets flip around, revealing all that yellow pollen. So there's only yellow pollen. The red is not pollen. And after a while of watching, this yellow-faced bumblebee female came by and dusted through all of the flowers. For reasons unknown, she was the only female that came by. She had that paradise to herself. The orange clump seen there on her hind leg is moistened, yet all the dry, dusty pollen has clung to her wings, her legs, and other parts of her body. We can even see the unattached pollen falling to the ground like powder. Our milkweed plants are unique. They produce pollen clumps called pollinaria, and the picture there you can see there's 2 arrows. They almost look like honey or glue, and scientists have found that this type of pollen is indigestible to bees, which means the females aren't likely to eat it. She visited this milkweed for nectar, and as she, or even other bees like her, move around from flower to flower, they effectively cross-pollinate by shoving that pollen onto the stigma of a different plant. So plants produce pollen in order to increase their reproductive success. The main goal is genetic variation. Pollinators, like bees, seek pollen in order to increase their reproductive success. Here's a little table of some of the popular local California native plants that are ideal for pollen. The table is sorted alphabetically by scientific name in the center there. Some of these flowers will also produce nectar, but they're especially good for pollen. So, plant native plants for both pollen and nectar. Thanks for watching.